Imagine surviving like a 13-week nightmare, trapped in this wooden box,
Like,
just pitching violently on the open Atlantic.
that sounds awful.
Yeah, and then only to spend the next several decades carving a homestead out of the brutal, freezing Michigan wilderness with an axe.
Right, just sheer manual labor.
Exactly. And then, after all that, your family's legacy is abruptly derailed by a damp pair of underwear in a French trench.
It's almost too bizarre to be true.
It really is. So today, we are definitely not looking at some sterile mathematical family tree. We aren't checking off birth dates and death dates in little boxes for this deep dive.
Because, lived experience just never fits neatly into a box. It's messy, it's contradictory, and it is usually defined by the things that catch you entirely off guard.
So true. We are opening up this remarkably preserved manuscript titled Willett Family and Branches. It was written over the winter of 1923 and 1924 by a guy named Richard L. Willett.
And we are skipping the endless recitations of distant cousins and who begat whom, right?
Oh, absolutely. Our focus is entirely on the life-changing, the surprising, and really the deeply emotional realities of one family's history. And it's told straight through the eyes of the man who lived it.
Which makes it so raw. It's a first-hand, visceral account of this massive transition from the old world.
Yeah, specifically England in the 1830s.
Right. Straight into the unforgiving American frontier, and it tracks right up to the creeping modernity of the 1920s.
It is essentially the story of North America modernizing, but you are watching it happen from a single family's living room.
Yeah, you see the macro-historical events like the Industrial Revolution, the Civil War, World War I, but you only see them through this micro-historical lens.
Right, like how they physically and psychologically mangled or, I guess, elevated this specific group of people.
Exactly. And it kicks off with just the ultimate inciting incident. You really have to put yourself in this mindset.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So it's 1833. The author's grandfather, Richard Willett I, is an overseer of a large estate in England.
Okay, so he's doing all right.
Yeah, he has a trade, he is a cabinet maker, he has a really stable life. But he decides to he packs up his wife, his 4 sons, his 2 daughters, and some grandchildren, and they board a sailing vessel for North America.
Wow. Just up and leaves.
Yep. And they are on the ocean for 13 grueling weeks.
13 weeks. I mean, we really need to pause on that.
It's a huge amount of time. To put that in perspective, a standard crossing for a packet ship in the 1830s might be 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the weather.
Okay, so 13 weeks is...
It means catastrophic weather. It means becalming, being blown completely off course. It means the drinking water turns foul, the rations dwindle to hardtack and salted meat, and diseases like typhus or dysentery just run rampant in the steerage.
And think about the youngest son of that family, George Willett. He's the author's father. George is only 9 years old during that 13-week crossing.
A 9-year-old dealing with that.
Yeah, he spends a quarter of a year in the dark, smelling pitch and sickness, just hearing the timbers groan.
And by the time he turns 13, the author notes that George, and I quote, really commenced to support himself and did thereafter.
That is wild. The psychological framing is set right there for the rest of his life.
You see a total stripping away of childhood. A 13-year-old functioning as a fully self-sustaining economic unit in the wilderness of 1830s North America.
It's hard to even picture that today.
Right. George was working to support not only himself, but to bolster his parents. He learned immediately that survival isn't guaranteed.
No, it is negotiated daily through physical labor.
Which makes his next major life decision absolutely staggering.
Oh, the trade. We have to talk about the trade.
Yes. So George grows up. He buys a farm in Canada, a really nice, comfortable 60-acre farm at a place called Arkona.
Right, the land is cleared, it is civilized, he gets married, he starts having kids.
And then in 1863, he does something that completely defies modern logic. He executes a direct trade with a man named William Johnson.
He trades his comfortable, settled 60 acres for 160 acres of absolute, untamed wilderness across the border in Michigan.
I really want you, the listener, to grasp the mechanics of this trade. Because it's not just moving to a larger house.
No, trading a cleared farm for 160 acres of virgin wilderness is it's like cashing out a perfectly secure, fully funded retirement account to buy a single lottery ticket in an unmapped country.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, or like trading a comfortable suburban home for a massive, unlivable plot of land on Mars. The leverage is massive. Yes, you get 100 more acres, but the failure rate is near total.
Absolutely. The manuscript specifies that out of those 160 acres, only about 2 were actually cleared.
2 out of 160.
Yeah, and maybe 7 were, quote, chopped, ready to be burned and cleared. There was a tiny log house and an unfinished log barn, and that's it.
And you have to look at the physical reality of what uncleared meant in Michigan in 1863.
Oh, yeah. This isn't a pleasant meadow. This is dense old-growth timber, massive hardwoods.
Huge root systems. You cannot plow it. You cannot plant crops.
No, to eat, you have to cut down the trees by hand, burn the stumps, pull the roots out with horses, and then break the virgin soil.
The sheer caloric output required to just make the land survivable is astronomical.
And the journey to get there. The author notes they set out on May 1st, 1863, with a covered wagon and a pair of dappled gray horses.
But he specifically writes that there were no road on any regular lines, no bridges over streams.
Taking a loaded wagon and 2 horses through an untamed forest with no infrastructure.
The wildlife was so unbothered by human presence that deer would just stand on the footpaths watching them.
Because the roads were nothing more than game trails. And their nearest neighbor was a man named John Seaton, living entirely alone in a dirt floor log hut a full mile away.
Wow. You are isolated in a profound, almost terrifying way.
Which brings up the psychological profile required to survive this.
Yeah, when you are that isolated, you are your own government, your own police force, your own moral compass.
The text gives us this brilliant look into George Willett's mindset. The author says, I, his oldest son, have no recollection or remembrance of him ever using vulgar or profane language.
He never swore, he was strictly honest, used tobacco very moderately, and only drank liquor as medicine.
It's the creation of an intense internal structure because the external world has none.
Right, when you live in a chaotic wilderness where nature is actively trying to reclaim your tiny clearing, you have to police your own boundaries rigidly.
His morality, his faith. He affiliated with the United Brethren Church because there wasn't a Baptist church for 30 miles. Those were his psychological guardrails.
Yeah, if you start letting things slide, if you succumb to the chaos of your environment, you die. Discipline is survival.
But he doesn't survive this solely on his own discipline. We have to look at his wife, Nancy Smith Willett.
Nancy is incredible. The text describes her as having a very strong constitution, seldom sick.
But in an environment with no hospitals, no doctors on call, Nancy essentially steps into the vacuum. She becomes the neighborhood physician.
Because the frontier required multifaceted utility from everyone.
Right. The author writes that in the sick room, she had few equals, and neighbors from miles around constantly called for her in cases of illness.
She possessed a practical medical knowledge born entirely of necessity.
The ultimate proof of her stamina is hidden toward the end of George's life, though.
This part is so intense. The manuscript records that when George falls chronically ill, Nancy stays by his side.
The author writes that during the 2 entire years that her husband was sick, she scarcely slept night, was constantly at his bedside until his death.
Think about the mechanics of caregiving in the 1880s rural landscape. 2 years.
2 years. There are no heart monitors, no electric lights, no running water, no shift nurses coming in to give her a break.
It is just Nancy in a farmhouse, constantly monitoring breathing, changing linens by hand, managing pain with whatever rudimentary treatments were available day and night for 24 months.
The physical endurance required to sustain that level of hypervigilance without collapsing is just unfathomable today.
It really makes me want to seriously challenge an assertion the author makes earlier in the manuscript.
Oh, well, which one?
Well, when he's writing about his Uncle William crossing the ocean, he casually writes off William's survival as him being one of that type of English who are noted for their stubbornness.
Ah, right.
He chalks it up to a national trait. But looking at Nancy's 2-year bedside vigil, or George trading a safe farm for a wilderness nightmare, that is not an English cultural quirk.
No, not at all.
It seems to me that this extreme stubbornness was a non-negotiable biological requirement. It was an evolutionary filter.
That's a fascinating way to frame it. You are talking about a selection process.
Exactly.
The frontier aggressively weeded out anyone who wasn't completely relentless. What the author politely calls stubbornness, we would define as extreme grit.
Yeah, if you had the capacity to give up, if you couldn't endure the cold or the isolation or the physical trauma, you simply did not last a single winter in a log cabin with no roads.
The people who propagated the family line were the ones who possessed this terrifying level of resilience.
But as this family establishes themselves, you realize that Isolating yourself in the woods doesn't grant you immunity from the rest of the world.
No, the timeline moves forward, and the slow, grinding warfare against the trees is violently interrupted by the realities of the 19th century.
The frontier wasn't just dangerous because of nature. The broader sweep of national history, like the Industrial Age and the Civil War, was about to violently intersect with the Willets.
You seek a quiet life, but you find yourself in a dual meat grinder. The mid-1800s introduced sudden, mechanized traumas that these rural families were completely unprepared for.
Let's examine Uncle David first. This is George's brother, a carpenter.
Right.
Around 1865, he comes down to Michigan to visit the family. And while he is working in a small sawmill on the Little Muskegon River, the text casually drops in that he met with a serious accident by which his leg had to be amputated.
A traumatic amputation in a rural 1860s sawmill. We really need to unpack how horrific that mechanism of injury
It's
is.
gruesome.
Early circular saws in these water-powered mills were notoriously exposed. There were no safety guards, no emergency shutoffs.
The belts and blades moved with immense, unstoppable torque. A slip of the foot on sawdust, and the machinery simply pulled you in.
And think about the medical care available at a rural Michigan lumber camp in 1865.
Anesthetics were rudimentary. Antibiotics didn't even exist.
This is the Industrial Revolution literally reaching out and tearing a family member apart. It perfectly encapsulates the new threats of the era.
The machinery they needed to conquer the timber was just as deadly as the timber itself.
And parallel to this industrial violence is the organized slaughter of the American Civil War.
Yeah, Nancy's family, the Smiths, are pulled directly into it. The author refers to it as the War of the Rebellion.
William Smith enlists in the Union Army early on. The manuscript notes he saw intense service, was wounded, taken prisoner, and died.
And it's the location of his death that stops you cold. Andersonville Prison.
For a family that fled England to seek autonomy, to have a son end up in Andersonville is the ultimate dark irony.
I mean, even if you assume a general knowledge of the Civil War, the sheer logistical nightmare of Andersonville requires focus.
It was a Confederate POW camp in Georgia designed to hold 10,000 men,
Okay.
but it eventually held over 30,000.
Over 30,000 in a space for 10.
Yeah, it wasn't just a prison. It was an engineered humanitarian crisis. There was virtually no shelter, just a tiny stream that served as both the drinking water and the latrine,
Oh, God.
and rations that were essentially non-existent. Nearly 13,000 Union soldiers died there from scurvy, diarrhea, and starvation.
So William Smith wasn't killed on a glorious battlefield. He was slowly consumed by deliberate logistical neglect.
Exactly. Then you look at the other brother, Henry Smith. Henry enlists, serves his time, and miraculously survives. He even goes home to Canada.
But then he re-enlists. He goes back into the fray.
And the author makes a very specific point to call out the commanding general.
Yeah, he writes that Henry was under the command of General George E. McClellan and was forced to winter in almost a swamp, which ruined his health.
That detail about McClellan is brilliant historical shade.
Right. McClellan was infamous for his extreme caution, his slow movements, and getting his armies bogged down during the Peninsula Campaign.
The text lays the blame squarely on the environmental reality of military mismanagement. When an army camps in a swamp over a winter, you are dealing with dysentery, malaria, typhoid fever, and exposure.
The stagnant water and the mud become a more effective killer than Confederate artillery.
Henry's constitution was utterly destroyed by the environment his commanders forced him into. He returns home to Canada and dies shortly after in 1867.
You really have to sit with the psychological whiplash this family experienced.
It's a lot.
You endure a harrowing ocean crossing to escape the strictures of England. You trade your comfortable farm for a wilderness full of bears just to find your own patch of absolute freedom.
Yeah.
And within a single generation, your brother's leg is ripped off by an industrial circular saw, one brother-in-law is starved to death in a prisoner of war camp, and another rots in a swamp fighting a war for a country that your family isn't even fully native to yet.
It completely shatters the myth of the peaceful agrarian pioneer. The violence was systemic, it was in the machines, it was in the politics, and sometimes it was literally falling from the sky.
Which perfectly brings us to the barn incident.
Oh, the barn.
George Willett spends decades engaged in back-breaking toil. Finally, he finds some success. In 1870, he manages to build a large frame house. And around 1876, he finishes a massive basement barn.
This is a monument to his victory over the wilderness, a massive piece of infrastructure.
And then in 1898, it is struck by lightning and burns completely to the ground.
A basement barn of that era filled with dry hay acts almost like an incinerator once ignited. The thermodynamics are devastating.
The author calmly notes, also a horse and cow was burned to death in the same fire.
Decades of capital accumulation, the physical embodiment of their survival, eradicated by a random weather event.
The way Richard Willett records all of this trauma is fascinating, though. He doesn't write sweeping emotional diatribes about the unfairness of the universe.
No, he meticulously, stoically logs the brutality. This happened, then this burned, then he died. It's a journalistic survival mechanism.
He is attempting to impose order on a chaotic history through documentation. Which brings us to Richard himself.
Right, because emerging from this brutal environment of swamp fevers, amputations, and lightning strikes is the author Richard L. Willett.
And Richard is determined to build something that lasts. He chronicles his own coming of age, and it is a testament to the sheer physical brutality required to ascend the socioeconomic ladder in this era.
He writes that in the winter of 1879, he felled the timber on 20 acres of land, and the crucial word he uses is unaided.
Let's break down the mechanics of felling 20 acres of virgin timber unaided in a Michigan winter.
We are talking about using a felling axe and a two-man cross-cut saw, but operated by one man.
You are dealing with massive hardwood trunks, negotiating the perilous physics of a falling tree, limbing the branches, bucking the logs.
Doing this alone in freezing temperatures requires a daily caloric burn that is difficult to comprehend.
The blistered hands, the muscle fatigue, the constant threat of being crushed by a widowmaker branch. It is a quiet, desperate kind of heroism.
He leverages that brutal labor to save money, and eventually, he trades his way out of the woods. He transitions from farm labor to owning a general store in the village of Altona.
And he becomes the epicenter of the community. For 18 years, he runs the store, but he also serves as the postmaster for 12 years.
A notary public for 16 years.
The town clerk for 20 years, a school inspector, a township supervisor. He essentially was the local government apparatus.
But here is the critical part.
Yeah.
He freely admits he didn't do any of this alone.
No, the emotional core of the manuscript centers on his marriage to Grace Allen Brander. Richard writes very plainly, "This was the best move that I ever made."
I love the earnestness of that. But what really struck me is the vulnerability of what follows.
Yeah, Richard, writing in the 1920s as the patriarch of this family, explicitly states on the record that his own education was lacking.
He says he was forced into common labor because he wasn't educated enough for the business world. Grace, on the other hand, was highly educated. She was a former school teacher.
And Richard writes, "My wife, being much better educated than myself, gave me the necessary assistance in the various offices to which I was called to serve."
I want to dig into this dynamic. For a Victorian-era man to so explicitly credit his wife's superior intellect for his own public political success, it's highly unusual.
Do you read this as Richard performing a sort of pioneer humility, downplaying his own smarts? Or was he genuinely reliant on her in a way that defied the gender norms of his era?
I think it's a profound recognition of asset allocation on the frontier. The harshness of the environment forced a functional equality that Eastern Victorian society could afford to ignore.
That makes sense. Richard understood the biomechanics of felling 20 acres of timber.
But Grace understood the mechanics of municipal law, ledger balancing, and bureaucratic navigation.
A former schoolteacher was the ultimate strategic advantage if you wanted to transition from a lumberjack to a town clerk.
He wasn't threatened by her intellect. He recognized it as the engine of their upward mobility. It's a very modern partnership.
And that profound partnership makes the tragedies they face even more devastating. They ascend socially, but they are hit with the defining sorrow of the 19th century, infant mortality.
Yeah. The manuscript records the birth of their first son in 1879, who lives only 2 weeks.
Richard writes, "This, our first sad experience, we knew we must give him up. Then we could sympathize with others who had lost some of their children."
There is a tragic resignation in that phrasing. We knew we must give him up.
In the 1870s, the neonatal mortality rate was so staggeringly high that families almost braced themselves for it. It was an expected, albeit deeply painful, part of building a family.
But then you see the emotional armor crack. Years later, their son Arden dies at nearly 3 years old, and Richard's writing fundamentally shifts.
He says, "It seemed at the time we could not give him up."
The psychological shift between those two sentences is enormous. A 2-week-old infant is a tragic loss of potential, but a 3-year-old is a walking, talking personality.
They have a place at the table. To lose a toddler to disease strips away all the stoic pioneer mythology.
It seemed we could not give him up, is the raw, unadorned wail of a shattered parent. It forces us to remember that these stoic figures in black and white photographs were emotionally devastated by these losses.
Yet, despite the grief, Richard maintains this incredible warmth, this poetic soul under the grit.
He does.
He writes about his brother, John William Willett, meeting a young lady named Rose Ward. And Richard, the guy who clear-cut a forest by hand, describes their courtship by writing, "Soon they found themselves in the love's lane."
This lane led in the usual way, and they got married. He has this wonderful romanticism.
He absolutely does. And as Richard settles into his role as a civic leader, writing poetry in his ledgers, you notice that the relentless pioneer drive of the Willett family doesn't dissipate.
No, it simply migrates. Michigan was becoming too settled, too civilized, so the psychological engine pushes the next generation further west.
Right. Richard's cousin, Newton Edwin Davis, embodies this perfectly. It's the 1880s. The trees in Michigan are mostly cut. The towns are established.
Newton looks at this and decides he needs the unbroken horizons.
Yeah.
He heads out to the absolute flatlands of North Dakota.
And the mechanics of this expansion are fascinating. He heads out with two young men referred to in the text as the Hayfie Boys.
Their strategy is to build board shanties, hastily constructed temporary wooden shacks out on the prairie to establish land claims.
But the reality of the Dakota prairie is vicious. The relentless wind, the freezing temperatures, the mind-bending isolation of flat land in every direction.
Very quickly, the physical and psychological toll breaks one of the Hayfie boys. He hates it. He gives up and decides to abandon the claim.
This is the critical moment for Newton Davis. Instead of folding, Davis leverages the other man's failure.
He buys the Hayfie boys' claim outright. He absorbs his partner's land.
And through sheer, untiring energy over the decades, Davis amasses a sprawling 960-acre estate.
He becomes wildly wealthy and even gets elected to the state legislature in Bismarck.
The modern parallel to this is striking. Reading about the Hayfie boys tapping out and Davis buying them up, it is exactly the dynamic of early-stage tech startups.
Oh, totally.
You have three co-founders in a freezing garage or board shanty in the Dakotas working 20-hour days. It's miserable.
Right. And one founder decides the equity isn't worth the suffering, says, "I'm going back to corporate," and sells his shares for pennies.
And the guy who stays, Newton Davis, scoops up all that equity, rides out the misery, and becomes a multimillionaire legislator. He was the ultimate frontier venture capitalist, absorbing risk for massive future leverage.
It's an apt comparison, but the author makes sure to include a deeply revealing quirk about Davis.
Ah, yes.
Despite his 960 acres, his massive barns, his immense wealth, and his legislative status in the 1920s, Newton Davis flat out refused to use internal combustion tractors.
The text explicitly notes he uses only horses to do the work. For some reason, he believes that the tractors are not profitable.
I was waiting to bring this up. The author says, for some reason, but if we look at the timeline, I think we can theorize exactly why.
We initially look at this as just a stubborn old man rejecting modernity, but think back a generation.
Uncle David had his leg ripped off by an industrial sawmill.
George's massive barn was destroyed by a lightning strike, burning the animals inside.
Do you think Davis's refusal to use tractors is actually a multi-generational trauma response to industrial machinery? A deep-seated distrust of mechanization?
That is a highly compelling read of the text. It makes perfect sense. The Willett family built their empire on muscle, blood, and bone.
They trusted the dappled gray horses that pulled them through the roadless woods.
When the combustion engine arrives, promising efficiency but carrying the threat of mechanized failure or injury, Davis draws a line in the Dakota dirt.
He knows horses. He understands their limits. A tractor represents the uncontrollable industrial age that already maimed his family. He opts for biological reliability over mechanical leverage.
But the tragic irony is that you cannot hold the mechanized world at bay forever. You can refuse to buy a tractor in North Dakota, but you can't stop the globe from turning.
Which pulls us into the darkest, most agonizing era of this manuscript, World War I.
The macro history comes crashing back into the living room.
The mechanized global warfare that defined the 20th century reaches out and grabs the next generation of Willett boys.
They survived the ocean, they survived the timber, they conquered the prairie, but they cannot escape the industrial slaughter of Europe.
The sheer scale of the conflict they are pulled into is horrifying. The manuscript lists them, Donnell Willett goes to France, is gassed with poison gas,
Yep.
somehow survives, goes back to the front, and is wounded again.
Charles Gordon Willett, a first lieutenant, fights at the Battle of Juvigny, is severely injured, and spends 10 weeks in a hospital.
They are being fed into the teeth of the deadliest machinery ever invented.
But the emotional nucleus of this entire 90-year saga, the passage that genuinely requires you to stop and take a breath, is the fate of Richard's own son, Arthur.
Arthur Willett. Richard describes him as a fine-appearing, energetic young man. He had attended business school, he was educated, but he wanted to see the world.
So in 1917, he enlists. He becomes a sergeant major in the 58th Infantry, 4th Division of the Regular Army.
And Arthur doesn't just sit in a reserve unit. He is thrust into the absolute epicenter of the cataclysm.
The text specifically names the battles he fought in. Château Thierry, the Battle of the Marne, the Argonne Forest.
You have to understand the environment of the Argonne. It was an apocalyptic landscape of shattered trees, relentless artillery barrages that turned the earth to liquid mud, machine gun nests, and mustard gas.
Arthur survives all of it. He survives the German artillery, he survives the bullets.
But he cannot survive the ruthless, unbending logistics of the Allied war machine. Richard records the exact hyperspecific mechanism of Arthur's death, and it is devastating in its mundanity.
Richard writes that during a relentless long march, the soldiers had discarded most of their excess clothing to save weight.
Arthur was down to his very last suit of underclothes.
They get a brief halt. Arthur takes this rare moment to wash his only underclothes. But before the cotton can dry by the fire, orders come down from command.
The unit must move immediately.
The machine doesn't wait for laundry. And the text says, "So was forced to put his wet underclothes on again. In that way, he took a severe cold."
A severe cold contracted on September 28th. Because of the compromised conditions, the exhaustion, the dampness, it rapidly develops into pneumonia.
Arthur is moved to a field hospital, but the hospital itself is threatened by advancing enemy forces.
So they are forced to evacuate him to a second hospital. His exhausted constitution simply cannot endure the constant movement and the infection.
He is sick for 9 agonizing days, and on October 7, 1918, Arthur Willett passes away.
I want you to think about the absolute absurdity of this. Think of Richard sitting at his desk in Michigan writing this down.
His son faced down the might of the German Empire in the deadliest battles in human history, only to be killed by wet laundry and an inflexible officer barking orders to march.
It is so brutally unglamorous. It reveals the terrifying fragility of life. A war isn't just about who shoots who. It's about the sheer biological toll of the logistics.
You can feel Richard's historical, stoic persona completely collapse in this section.
He isn't just a chronicler anymore. He is a broken father. He literally interrupts his own narrative flow to write, "It is with sorrow and a heavy heart that I write these lines."
And then he adds this detail that feels like a gut punch. He notes that earlier that year, in February 1918, Arthur had taken out a government insurance policy of $10,000 made payable to his father.
The blood money arrives, but the boy doesn't.
You can imagine Richard torturing himself with the agonizing what-ifs.
What if the orders to march came just 1 hour later? What if the fire had been hotter? What if he just hadn't washed them?
It is a highly specific, entirely preventable detail that will haunt a family's lore for generations.
And that profound agony sets up the final tragedy of the manuscript, because the armistice is signed. The surviving boys, the ones who are gassed and shot, return home.
But the emotional casualties don't stop when the treaties are signed. Grief exacts a final, sudden toll on the family matriarch.
We are now in 1920. Arthur has been dead for roughly a year and a half, and Richard turns his pen to his wife, Grace.
The former schoolteacher, the brilliant mind who helped him run the town, the best move he ever made.
Richard makes a profound psychological observation about Grace. He writes that she bore the grief of Arthur's death in silence.
She didn't have the outlet of compiling this massive family history. She didn't have the public role. She internalized the catastrophic loss of her son.
Then we get to January 28, 1920. Richard explains that he had been away from the house for about 6 hours.
When he walks back through the front door, he finds Grace dead on the floor. She was 64 years old.
And the detail of exactly what she was doing when she died is so heavily loaded with the symbolism of the changing century.
She had been talking on the telephone.
She simply collapsed from her chair while holding the receiver and passed away suddenly.
A telephone. Put that in the context of this entire narrative arc. We started this story with George Willett as a 9-year-old boy, spending 13 weeks on a wooden sailing ship relying on the wind.
And we are ending it with his daughter-in-law dying mid-conversation over a telecommunications wire.
The technological leap within a single overlapping lifespan is staggering. The frontier is officially dead. The modern world has fully arrived.
It perfectly symbolizes the rapid modernization that swept away their pioneer past. But beneath the technological symbolism, there is a serious medical and psychological question.
Richard explicitly notes her silent grief over Arthur right before describing her sudden cardiac event.
From a modern diagnostic perspective, we might look at that as Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, literally broken heart syndrome, where extreme emotional stress causes a sudden, fatal weakening of the heart muscle.
Richard seems to implicitly understand that the unspoken heartbreak of the Great War is what ultimately killed his wife on that phone call.
Absolutely. The trauma weakened the system until it gave out. And Richard's reaction to finding her is the most devastating, unshielded admission in the entire text.
This man who built towns, who felled forests, writes, "If it were not for our family, I would be tempted to believe that life was not worthwhile."
That is the sound of a man who has lost his foundational anchor. The frontier tested his body, but the modern world broke his heart.
But observe what he does with that grief. He doesn't retreat into the empty house and rot. In 1922, he makes a highly deliberate choice.
He sells the home. He liquidates the entire estate.
And he divides the proceeds equally among his 8 surviving children. He distributes the legacy while he is still alive to see them utilize it.
It's a beautifully poignant act of choosing the living over the dead. He refuses to let the capital of their survival turn into a mausoleum. He gives it to the future.
And then, unburdened by property, he spends his final years utilizing the modern railway system to traverse the exact continent his family spent 90 years slowly conquering by wagon.
He travels to Florida, to Washington, D.C., to Oregon, visiting the family branches.
And it leads to this wonderful full-circle moment near the very end of the document. Richard travels to Flint, Michigan to visit his Aunt Sarah.
Sarah is 88 years old. She is a direct living link to the very beginning of the story.
And Richard makes a point to note that her mind is still wonderfully sharp. She fully retains her reasoning faculties.
You have these two elders sitting in an industrialized city, still carrying the memories of the ocean swells, the dappled gray horses, and the silent woods.
When you pull back and look at the sheer scope of this manuscript, you realize Richard L. Willett achieved exactly what he set out to do in the winter of 1923.
He didn't just write a list of begats and birth dates. He captured the raw mechanics of an era.
He left behind a monument to his family's resilience, built entirely of ink, unvarnished honesty, and meticulous memory.
He showed us that history isn't just sweeping political movements. It is a wet pair of underclothes on a march in France.
It is a bolt of lightning striking a barn. It is a sudden collapse while talking on a telephone. Which brings me to a final thought I want you, the listener, to mull over as we end this dive.
Every single one of you listening right now has a document like this waiting to be written.
Or perhaps it's already slipping away, lost to time. We tend to think our lives are defined by our resumes or our major milestones.
But if a descendant were to dig up the history of your life 100 years from now, what seemingly small, hyper-specific, mundane details of your daily routine would become the defining emotional touchdowns of your era?
Will it be a dead smartphone battery during a family emergency? A spilled cup of coffee that led to a chance meeting? The exact misunderstood phrasing of a late-night text message that changed the trajectory of a relationship?
When the macro history of our time is written, what tiny, agonizing, or beautiful detail of your specific life will be the thing that makes a stranger a century from now pause and finally understand exactly what it meant to be you?
It forces you to look at your own daily routine, your own historical muddy waters, with an entirely different level of reverence.
It really does. Pay attention to the details.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Willett family. Until next time.